Hello there, friends and enemies. Look at this wild setup. For as long as I have been a horror fan, and more specifically, horror video game fan. Another aspect of my life that kind of converges with this is that I have always been a large fan of handheld consoles. The DS, the PSP, the PS Vita, 3DS, any handheld console you can think of, I was a big fan of. In fact, the Game Boy Advance was one of the first consoles that I was really wanting to get. And being a child who was a lover of horror, of course, with these handheld consoles, I would try to find horror games that went with them. And my favorite horror game of those was Demetium the Ward. Dementium the Ward is a survival horror FPS game released on the Nintendo DS on October 31st, 2007 by developer Renegade Kid. It would spawn a sequel, Dementium 2, in 2010, which would go on to get a remaster of itself in 2013. Now, I was planning here to talk about how Dementium 2 got a remaster, but Dementium the Ward never did. However, right before going to actually do this review, I found out that that is incorrect. In 2015, for the 3DS, Dementium the Ward was remastered as Dementium Remastered. Therefore, I must note that the version of Dementium that I played that I will be looking at for this review specifically is the 2007 Nintendo DS cartridge for the original Dementium the Ward. So let's go ahead and jump right into my favorite handheld horror game. Dementium the Ward is a game where you wake up in an abandoned hospital and you have to find your way out while fighting horrors beyond your imagination. It's very simple, straightforward, to the point, kind of a beaten to death horror trope, but I think it really works in the scope of this game. The gameplay of Dementium the Ward feels really good. The controls feel incredibly tight and responsive, and it feels like they correctly integrated the touch controls with the button controls. I do wish, with the high stress and tension of it being an FPS survival horror, that it would be a little bit easier just to aim and select your weapons, and Dementium 2 remedies this just a bit by allowing you to have a flashlight alongside a weapon, which just makes the game a little bit better, but I do still enjoy the control scheme and the way in which the gameplay of Dementium the Ward works. One of the most notable parts of Dementium the Ward is the variety of enemies. You already have a big number of enemy types that all act different ways, make different sounds, and treat you in a different way when they're interacting with you. Later on in the game, for some of these enemy types, you get alternate versions of those enemies that act just so slightly different. And this makes the enemy variety and the gameplay always feel fresh and make it feel like a good puzzle. It honestly makes resource management feel good, especially when you discover that it's really easy to run around a room that has slow walking enemies that can't quite get to you. I would say that it turns both resource management and combat into a puzzle in and of itself, and it's a pretty easy and simple puzzle, but it makes the game a little more fun. Now, this enemy variation even goes up to the bosses, giving each boss a specific, differing feel. They all feel like they have their own moveset, they all feel like their own distinct type of monster, which makes fighting them feel really good. It gives you a challenge without making the game be too frustrating. The actual puzzles that are integrated into the gameplay are generally very simple. They're not that hard to figure out, however, they're not entirely straightforward either. You do have to find the answers to the puzzles or sometimes go to a different room to kind of calculate the answer out using various objects or what have you, and this makes puzzles in Dementium the Ward not feel like a chore. In my opinion, I feel like it makes them feel very fun to go through. The story of Dementium the Ward is very formulaic, very tropey, and it's hidden in notes and the environment like we've come to expect from a lot of survival horror games. For the most part, the story is to the point. There might be some parts of the story that get a little bit confusing or maybe a little bit muddled along the way, but overall, the story is fairly simple to understand and get a grasp of. Personally speaking, I believe that the art design of Dementium the Ward is incredibly good. The monster design is simple, but it is striking and effective. It really kind of feels like good spooky monster design, from my point of view at least. The environment of the hospital that you're stuck in is incredibly simple, but it does loop and it feels a little bit repetitive, which, coming from someone that used to work in a hospital, kind of fits the actual theme of being in a real hospital. Sometimes it gets a little bit confusing to walk around. It also gives the game a sort of dreamlike quality that I think really adds to the effectiveness of its atmosphere. The sound design of Dementium really works. I think they do a really good job with sound design. All of the monsters make different sounds, and sometimes it might be a little bit hard to differentiate the sounds, but once you get used to them, you'll be able to pick up what monster is in what hallway just like that. While it's not entirely prevalent, there's also on occasion atmospheric sound that I believe really adds to the tension, really gives you a little bit of a worry of what you're going to see or run into next. Adding on to that is the music, which is very stereotypical, very tropey kind of horror music, but I think it really works with the type of game that Dementium is. We have to remember that Dementium is a 2007 DS game, so it's kind of close-ish to being very arcade-like, very bit-crushy type of sounds and music, and I think the music being a very horror tropey really is boosted by that bit crush of the original DS. I think it works incredibly well, and it pulls the game together very beautifully. Dementium the Ward, at very few points in time, can be a little bit frustrating. It can feel a little bit jump scary, which might make you get a little bit sick of it, might feel a little bit cheap, which is understandable. We see nowadays in a lot of horror games that they rely kind of solely on jump scares. So it can feel, when you're looking for a monster and they just happen to pop out and hit you, it can feel a little bit cheap. It can feel a little bit like a jump scare. However, I don't believe that was the intention behind the design philosophy of Dementium. That being said, I believe that Dementium the Ward is an incredibly fun, simple little horror game for the DS. It really takes the way that the DS visualizes things and the way that the DS processes things and uses it to its advantage. Ultimately, I think it's safe to say that Dementium the Ward is a horror movie that you get to enjoy as a video game. But those are my thoughts on Dementium the Ward. How do you feel about Dementium? Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found something to enjoy about this video, and until next time, as always, drink your water.